Hello and welcome back. My name is Mark Blyth. I am the director of the Rhodes Centre for International Economics and Finance. Today we're going to take a little bit of a detour. I'm going to do a conversation with David McCourt, who is an associate professor of sociology at UC Davis. So first of all, not an economist, not a political economist, a sociologist. And we're also not actually going to talk about something on a regular beat. We're going to talk about the notion of American hegemony. We're going to talk about the rise of China. And perhaps more interestingly, we're going to talk about the very notion that states have interests and form them in the same way that, economic actors do, and that they kind of look at the world. We have a tendency to anthropomorphize, to use that word, states when we think about foreign policy. China wants this, America wants this. And yet we know that when administrations change, what China wants seems to be a very different thing from what it wanted last week. So how do these factors filter into it? At a time when there's a trade conflict between the United States and China, at a time when there could be hints of geopolitical conflict more broadly, it's really important to know what's driving this. Is it kind of the objective security situation, which we like to think, or is it more subjective factors to do with who gets to speak authoritatively about what China is or is not at a given point in time? So being a sociologist, Dave, I'm going to bring you into the conversation at this point. Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us about the politics of expertise and how that figures into the stories of foreign policy and national interest that we usually think about.
Well, the first thing I would say is that you're right, that there are no objective national interests out there. What seem to be objective national interests, like China's growing military or the militarization of the South China Seas, are interpreted by the US national security community, by the government, by the intelligence services in various ways. And so we need to be careful of and to think about how exactly that interpretation process happens. The well-known example of why objective national interests aren't quite so objective are missiles, nuclear missiles. So Britain has nuclear missiles that the United States can't pick up. We could have a sub off the coast of Washington, D.C. pointed at the White House, and no one in the United States is actually thinking like that, not worried about it at all. Whereas Soviet nuclear missiles during the Cold War or Russian nuclear missiles today are a threat. So the question, and this is central to the constructivist approach to international relations theory, is that we need to think about how exactly national interests are interpreted and thought about. Now, traditionally, what we think about is we talk about, say, the main actors at the Pentagon, the National Security Council here in the United States, or the State Department, and those actors are absolutely crucial. And we'll talk about those, I'm sure, today, folks like Mike Pompeo and Trump himself in this case. But we also need to think about the broader community that talks about and has a professional investment in expert knowledge of other parts of the world, other issues, nuclear proliferation, China in this case, Russia, Africa, Latin America, and how they go about struggling over what they think might be America's national interests. The point is that national interests are always struggled over. They're always competed. They are the soccer ball in the soccer game, to sort of use a perhaps trite metaphor, but national interests are not objective and they're not settled things. They're always being competed over.
So we know this a little bit. I mean, the way that some IR scholars look at it is what's called bureaucratic politics. Now, that is to say, in terms of the Defense Department, who's got the most angle at a given point in time? Is it the Air Force? Is it the Navy? And the way that they do this is by playing particular threats to their advantage. So there's a kind of rent-seeking, entrepreneurial kind of political economy in this. But you're painting an even broader picture of this. That is, there's a community of knowledge. There's a whole bunch of people out there called China scholars, there are China watchers, there's China journalists, there's the business community in China, and then there's the military branches. And they all kind of interlink and network with each other in different ways. Now, the story that you told us today, fascinating story, which is food for a forthcoming book, is some version of the following. So just to get this on the table, I don't want to tell your story for you, but I just get it there so we can do it quickly, is that there used to be this policy. Back in the Cold War, the Russians were contained. We had containment. Now, what was it that we had with the Obama administration, who were the people who were trying to bring China into the international arena? What was their policy?
Under the first Obama administration, it was still engagement. We bring in China into the international community, and The idea behind that approach was, look, China might, if we continue to engage with them, they might liberalize, democratize, or that was the hope. Now, whether that's true is actually part of the debate going on today. People are now revisiting engagement and saying that was never really our hope. But engagement with China was justified, definitely, for a long time, under Obama and before, under Bush and Clinton, with the idea that if we do things like let China into the World Trade Organization, we will see progressive political change in China.
So that changed, but it didn't change because China radically changed. Your argument is it changed because of the people who get to talk about China, particularly in DC, they changed. They began to change. How did that work?
Well, it worked in a complicated way, which is why the story is not a nice, simple one of either China changing or a group of experts in the China watching community suddenly changing their view. So China did change, obviously. After 2011 or 2012, Xi Jinping came in and started to be a lot more authoritarian in various respects, internally and externally. And a casual look at the newspapers today and for the last few months will show us various ways in which that's true, like the mass internment of Muslims in Xinjiang, to concerns over Huawei and their potential for spying here in the United States and in the West. So it's not the case that China didn't change at all, but the timing of it is crucial because the interpretation of China as a threat and no longer an opportunity or a place in the world that we could change progressively, changed from the end of the second Obama administration. That's when the big changes started to happen.
So it's not just Trump. This goes before that.
It's not just Trump. The simple explanation would be Trump. Trump came into office in 2017 after an electoral cycle when he'd said some fairly bold things, shall we say, about what China had been doing to the American economy and the American worker. And he had a lot of electoral success with that. And he did bring in a group of experts that were much more hawkish and much more critical of China, wanting particularly some more reciprocal and transactional approaches by the United States to China when it comes to trade, to stamp down on the theft of intellectual property, to really stand up to China in terms of forced technology transfers.
But that was then. This was the Trump, right? What we're saying is Trump. This started before that, right?
So we can't explain the change in US-China policy and the end of engagement just by thinking about Trump, because this was already happening. This was already in the waters in the second Obama administration. Ashton Carter, for example, the Secretary of the Defense, made a strong speech in middle of 2015 saying that the United States needed a perspective on international politics that was much more to do with great power competition, strategic competition from particularly China. Now, that had not been language that has been used in US national security circles since the very beginning of the 1990s. From the 1990s and into the 2000s and into the 2010s, the dominant frame of US national security was counterinsurgency, anti-terrorism. This was very new in the second Obama administration, to go back to a rise and fall of great powers type of view on American national security interests.
Now, people who would take a different point of view would then say, yes, but come on, they're building islands and so on and so forth. But, in terms of strategic threat, building an island and sticking a few planes on it, basically just offshore, really isn't a giant threat to the United States. At the same time that this was going on, Russia's kicking off actual warfare in Europe and kind of gets a pass, which suggests that there's something going on here that's more than just the immediate material threats. So I want to push you on something you said in your talk, which I find fascinating. When you have, there's the notion of paradigm change, which you're familiar with, many people are familiar with. The notion of Thomas Cook had this idea about the structure of scientific revolutions, that basically you get one dominant way of looking at things. Everybody buys it for a long time. The world shifts under it. Holes in the theory start to crop up, the whole thing crashes, right? But there's another way that paradigm shift, and you see this in a lot of the social sciences, and I'm wondering if this is a direct extension, whereby the old eat the young. That is to say, there's a whole bunch of people that get to set the frame for a long time, and then basically the world changes under them, a new opportunity opens up, and then it's the younger people who are coming in. And the fastest way to make your name is to say, everything I learned from that guy was wrong. It's actually quite the opposite. Do you see these types of dynamics driving what's going on here?
Yeah, absolutely. I see paradigmatic turnover as being a sort of a crucial dynamic. And the interviewees that I spoke to saw this in the same way. Many of the China experts that I spoke to, who for the longest time had defended the idea that we must engage with Beijing and bring them into the rules-based international order, as they call it. Many of them had gone to China when China was exotic, when it was difficult to get to. Some had actually not studied in China at all before the mid-1970s and had gone to Hong Kong, where China watching, the term really harks back to when Westerners would go to Hong Kong and interview people who'd escaped from mainland China. And they would tell them the horrors of the Cultural Revolution. So many of the older China experts, people getting to their retirement age at the moment, got to go to China in the 1970s and early 1980s when it was very difficult to get there, and they were sort of exotic at that time. We're talking about 10s and 20s of number of people who could actually go, speak some Chinese, figure out what China was all about, and they made their careers on engagement, not just as a strategy, but as a practical, professional thing. They would come back to the United States and make careers, make centers of China expertise at their universities, foster business community connections. And that continued well into the 1990s. Well into the middle of the 1990s, it was very difficult to go to China still. It's only really at the late 1990s and into the 2000s when people go in vast numbers. So the China field has expanded exponentially, perhaps literally, from 10s and 20s of experts in the 1970s, the people that went with Henry Kissinger on the secret trips in 1972, to tens of thousands today who are engaged in a much, much more intense struggle over what China means. And certainly within that, there is then a younger group who have always known China as a regular country, not a friend within the Cold War, remember, because under the Cold War, China, we were friends with and selling weapons to. Just as an aside, Michael Pillsbury, one of the most hawkish really on China questions, a Trump advisor who wrote a book called The 100-Year Marathon, saying that by 2049, the Chinese leadership would like to have retaken Taiwan and fully rejuvenated the Chinese nation. In the 1980s, he worked in the Pentagon selling weapons to China because China was a friend. That changed after the end of the Cold War, obviously. And many of the younger experts, they have grown up with a normal China, and even some of the younger ones with an increasingly authoritarian post-Beijing Olympics China. And so certainly there is a paradigmatic turnover, the notion of writing against your academic or professional parents and, in a sense, killing them off.
And given that there's more of them in the field, they're all concentrated in DC, there's a limited amount of jobs. That does imply a kind of like get attention or be killed dynamic. Does that go on?
Yes, certainly. The China field has always had sort of two dynamics to it. On the one hand, it's been sort of friendly and insular, people tell me, but on the other hand, it's definitely cutthroat. And the ways in which China experts communicate, they communicate on listservs, over Twitter, in personal interactions at all of the very, very many events that go on daily in Washington, D.C. on issues of China. The knives have been out for a while, and I think what that means practically at the moment is that engagement is a naughty word.
Right.
And I think it certainly has the effect of ramping up China threat. And I don't think that's not a particularly controversial statement. I think even some more hawkish experts would say that there is a danger of threat escalation. Right. They admit it themselves.
So the way I've always thought about this was when John Mearsheimer started doing this stuff, he's a famous IR theorist for those of you who don't read this stuff, that John was one of the first people who said that, you know, China's a great powers always end up punching each other in the face, etc., etc. And I remember thinking to myself, what a wonderfully sort of constructivist argument he's actually making, which is, so I'm going to say this in a journal. I'm going to say that this is the way that we think about things. The Chinese are going to read this and then say, this is how the Americans think about this. We better get ready for a punch in the face. So how do you get ready for a punch in the face? Well, you rebuild your military, which means that John then turns around and goes, see, I told you they were aggressive. So we build these kind of cultures of insecurity through the way that we talk about the thing that we fear. And that seems to change almost irrespective of the actual material threat. When you get out there, that's quite a radical position to be in. How do most security scholars who are not sociologists think about that type of logic?
They would poo-poo that whole argument, essentially. There's an article recently by a couple of scholars from Britain about the think tank space in Europe and the creation of a narrative of China threat. And the vitriolic responses that I've seen in various fora about their argument, from this is dangerous because they're downplaying the China threat, to, well, this is silly. It's French social theory about othering or about narratives, or they get tarred and feathered. And so I'm assuming at some point I will be myself, because I'm arguing that the China threat is not as objective as we think it is, that it's being constructed by particular people and they're engaged in part professional, part political struggles, that they're doing it largely through language. It's often a very weak argument to make. Sociologists kind of like it because, well, it's true. We like to read our social theory and philosophy, and we're interested in how the world works. But within the national security community, I'm not expecting it to have much sway.
But here's the thing, though. I would think that at this moment in time, I might have that, because one of the things about Trump is that he seems to be the only president who doesn't go around starting wars. I mean, touch wood so far, right? And he's doing a deal with the Taliban, and he wants the end of endless wars and all this sort of stuff, right? So let's go back to the invasion of Iraq. So 9/11 happens, planes full of people from Saudi Arabia, let's invade Iraq. It's not exactly a straight line. And people who are very much realists like Mearsheimer write about how there was a particular set of people who were very influential in national security who pushed the entire thing that way. When you get that type of argument, it gets called a conspiracy theory. But when you're talking in a sociological language about fields, we see this all the time. Professions, this is how professions work, right? This is how social problems get defined as social problems. This is all bread and butter stuff. What is it about the security community that makes them so resistant to seeing themselves as basically suffering the same complaints as every other set of humans who work in organizations?
That's a good question. I think part of the answer is to do with the fact that it's a fairly coherent community that speaks the same language. And they speak the same language, I don't mean English, obviously. I mean the same sort of language of viewpoints of how the world works. And they actually speak the same language in many ways as the theorists, the academic types who theorize their world. And so when they step outside, what they think of outside of the national security community, outside the government, say, they actually talk to people who reflect the world that they see. They talk to people who speak the same conceptual language as them, we might say. When I talk about the conceptual language, I'm talking about things like objective national security threats, about states doing things. China wants X from the South China Sea. China wants to control East Asia and push the United States out, say. Or the United States has these particular national security interests. Let me just sort of give you an example of, say, the Indo-Pacific, the concept of the Indo-Pacific. This is not a natural area of the world. India and China not only having disputes over borders, they're not necessarily all part of one geographic space. The Middle East is actually the paradigmatic case there. The Middle East was really constructed when the Department of State in the 1910s started to separate out into certain areas of competence for the one or two people that it assigned to those areas. The same goes for the Indo-Pacific. There's nothing natural about putting China, Australasia, India, all lumped into one space. Now, that's really important then when it comes to China, because the national security folks looking at China then are talking to people who have expertise about China in particular. They're not East Asianists. they're mainly China folks. So what that means is that there's layers upon layers of people speaking within the same conceptual vocabulary, thinking in the same ways. Groupthink is obviously the psychologist's term for this, but they don't get out much, if we can put it in those terms. And so holding up a mirror, I think, is really important, but it's also very difficult because they don't really want to hear it oftentimes.
So there's two things that I want to finish the conversation on. So the first one is, what are the limits to this? Now, I absolutely acknowledge and want to stress that I know that you are not saying there's no such thing as real security threats. Of course there are, and of course you accept that, right? But there is a kind of, okay, so how far does this go? Can these experts imagine anything they want about China? No, there's limits, right? It has to somehow tack on to what they're observing. It has to fit that conceptual vocabulary, right? How do these foreign policy experts deal with things that happen that really goes beyond their conceptual vocabulary? All right, well, if China does something truly unexpected. So for example, just now we have coronavirus, and you could see the kind of China vocabulary being deployed. So the first one is, it's this authoritarian state that shut down this city, and this will never work, and this is what bad authoritarians do. And then it turns out the WHO go over and go, whoa, nice job, lads, actually, you did exactly the right thing, and it's kind of amazing. And then there's this kind of begrudging acceptance that, well, maybe that was there, but it's still, the type of thing that bad authoritarians do. And this is all completely subjective casting of an objective thing, which is basically there's a problem with the virus, right? So I guess if I have a question, my question is this. Is it in those moments when you can no longer describe it in that vocabulary that you kind of expose this community for who they are?
So I think what you're hinting at there is the political science, in political science speak, is these crisis moments or external shocks when punctuated equilibrium breaks down, right? Unfortunately, I don't actually buy that language too much. And I think where we might see change is not from from external sources, but from internal processes. And particularly, I think I would point to key agents like Trump himself. The main policymakers remain very important in my story. Trump tomorrow could turn around and say, and he actually has said this over coronavirus, Xi Jinping's doing a great job, and we should really work together with Xi Jinping on some international issues. Why don't we have a climate change summit? It's unlikely, I'll grant you that. But someone like Trump has that kind of power, political but symbolic and definitional. He began the trade war and he actually can end it. And so when I focus our conceptual lenses on experts and professions, it's in no way to say that security policymakers don't see a threat, nor is it to say that policymakers themselves are unimportant. They absolutely remain important. And so I'm not really sure that I agree that anything objective that China did would change the narrative absent certain key individuals here in the United States.
So in other words, what this suggests is that in fields of policymaking, not just security politics, there's a community of experts, and we live in this populist moment where, to quote the British minister Michael Gove, his famous quote, the public are a little bit sick of experts, right? And some experts are more exposed than others. So, I mean, if you were a free market economist who said that banks are the best judge of risk, 2008 has done your reputation quite a bit of damage, right? But if you exist in these kind of small interstitial spaces, you're this tightly networked community that is kind of in the government and out the government, you're not really getting that level of scrutiny. And your ability to influence where the state focuses, right? How, in a sense, to set the parameters on how likely it is that Trump could make that change if he chose to, is actually much more important than we think. Would you say that's fair?
I think I agree that different communities of experts are at risk in different ways of being politicized and therefore their expertise itself tainted. I mean, we're in a general crisis of expertise. The public don't believe that experts have everything to say, although, again, coronavirus might change that because we're talking about let's get the experts back in.
Well, the real question will be what it does to people who think vaccines are bad. Because when you get a corona vaccine, that's going to be very interesting.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think that at the moment, the China experts are below the radar and probably will remain so. a small, tight-knit community can still produce new generations of people that can go in and advise the US government on matters of China. But you're right. I think that the key issue is a broader societal issue with how we deal with experts and expertise. And you and I are not immune to that.
Far from it. So we started off by questioning whether it was sensible to think of states as these kind of unified things, almost like people that have interests. And we've basically ended up shaking that box out and exposing the people, the very different people and networks of people whose different ideas influence what we actually call the interests of state. I think that's a nice place to end it. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much for the conversation.
This episode of the Rhodes Centre podcast was produced by Dan Richards. You can subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favourite podcast app. If you like us, rate us on iTunes and help others find the podcast as well. For more information, go to watson.brown.edu/Rhodes. Thanks for listening.